Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to start turning to a completely different topic, the deontological philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And this really brings us into the modern period in philosophy. Aristotle was in the ancient period. He was alive and writing about 400 years or 300 between 380 to 400 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. So a very long time ago. Immanuel Kant is writing at the end of the 18th century, so the 1780s and 90s is when he's publishing his work on moral philosophy. So that's quite a big jump from 400 years before the birth of Jesus to 1790 years after the birth of Jesus. A lot has happened in that period, and a lot of that has to do with what happens to the views of Aristotle and Plato in the medieval period as they get interpreted by the Catholic Church and by Islam. So we're skipping all of that stuff and fast forwarding to the Enlightenment in the 18th century / the beginning of the 19th century. Okay, so now you may recall from earlier in these lectures that I mentioned that there was a split between ancient ethical theories and modern ethical theories over what the foundational question of ethics is. Is it what makes a person good, or is it what makes an action good? And it's this second question that Kant's moral theory is interested in addressing. So Kant is interested in the question, what makes an action good? And he's going to then tell us what a good person is in terms of possessing the thing that makes actions good. So remember, these two questions are related to each other. The only issue is which one is more primary, which one comes first. So now Kant gives an argument that what makes an action good is not its consequences, but is rather the motivation or intention of the person who's acting. And in particular, it's only one kind of motivation that matters for Kant. That's being motivated by one's moral duties. Now, we're not going to, at this point, we're going to get into this a lot in a bit, but at this point, I'm not going to say what a moral duty is, but it's at least important that we say at this stage that you recognize that this is moral duty. It's not just any duty. So Boy Scouts have duties, but they don't often have moral duties, at least not as members of that club. So we mean something very particular by one's actions being motivated by a moral duty, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so the basic thing here that Kant argues for is that there's something that he calls the good will. And the goodwill is the thing which is intrinsically valuable on Kant's view. So what is the will? Well, the will is just that thing which chooses to do something. And we've talked already about the issue of will and whether it's free or not, whether your choices are determined. Or whether you have some kind of a non-deterministic control, non-determined control over your actions. So that's the same thing that he's talking about here. A good person for Kant is one who possesses the good will, and the goodwill is having this kind of motivation that we previously spoke about. So a good action is defined as one that's motivated by one's moral duties, and a good person is one who has the goodwill. The goodwill being the thing which is determined by duty. So we all have choices to make in our day-to-day lives, and the good person is the one whose choices are determined or causally produced by one's moral duties. Now, that's all very quick, but that's the basic of Kant's view, and if you can understand that, you will go a long way towards understanding what his actual theory is. So I don't expect that you understand it right now, but keep that in mind, that a good person is one whose actions are produced by an explicit recognition of their moral duties. Now, Kant rejects happiness and virtues as intrinsically good, or in other words, the things that Aristotle postulated as intrinsically good. Kant rejects them because, for instance, the virtues aren't themselves intrinsically good, because whether they're good or not depends on who possesses them. So an evil person can be courageous. And as the book points out, someone who's truly evil but who possesses the virtues of wit and intelligence is much more of a destructive force than someone who doesn't possess those virtues. So Kant thinks, well, no, depending on who has the virtues, they're good or bad. So they're not bad in and of themselves, or good in and of themselves, excuse me. Now, even happiness, which Aristotle thought was the intrinsic good, happiness can lead to laziness or sloth, could lead to pride and presumption. So to sort of appreciate Kant's point here, think about the kind of life that Aristotle recommends that we pursue. Well, you have a family, you make good money, you have time to enjoy the finer things of life, discuss philosophy, have a respected in the community, etc., etc. But of course, oftentimes what happens to people is they become, well, less zealous, less apt to do those kinds of virtuous behaviors, and they kind of get lax. So you can think of the success arc of a celebrity. When they're first come on, they're working very hard to achieve the things that they want. They get to that stage, and then they become the kind of fat, bloated mess where they become lazy, even maybe arrogant, and somewhat of a quote-unquote diva, even if it's a male, and etc. So if the person's will, that is, if they're not constantly making the right kinds of choices, if the person's will isn't good, then these things, happiness and the virtues, can lead to bad things. So whether they're valuable depends not on themselves, says Kant, but on the will of the person. That is, a slogan way of putting this that Kant often did talk like this, actually. A slogany way of putting it is that, look, you have to deserve happiness. So those with the goodwill deserve happiness, and those with who have bad wills, they may have that kind of life, but we wouldn't want to say that they're good people if they're doing things for the wrong reason, or at least that's what Kant thinks. And the basic argument that he gives here is sort of a thought experiment about a rational, disinterested spectator. And so we're going to come back to that in a second, but he says that in the passage in the book. If some rational, disinterested spectator were looking down at the world, the goodwill would shine like a jewel. Now that's a provocative metaphor, and we're going to come back to it later in these lectures. But for now, let's talk a little bit more about duty. So I mentioned that Kant's kind of theory is what's called deontological, and that's because the Greek word here, deontos, means duty or obligation, and so a deontological theory is one that has duty as the central notion, and it's a moral theory that's concerned with discovering what the duties of people are and on what foundation they rest. Now, as I was careful to point out earlier, not just any duty will do here. So it's got to be something that's produced. This is Kant's view. The moral duties are those things which are produced by some kind of law which is necessary and universal and covers all persons at all times. So Kant really is an absolutist. So he thinks that there is something called the moral law, which is a law which governs the universe, just like any other law. And when he says law like any other, what he means is like a law of logic of the sort that we find as the foundation of logic, like that of the law of non-contradiction, which claims that no contradictions can be true. These are fundamental claims made on rational persons. And Kant's idea, the thing that we're going to try to unpack over the next couple of weeks, is to get at this idea that it's really this sense of rationality which is the foundation for morality. And when he means rationality, he literally means this business about contradiction. So we're going to talk more about what it means to be inconsistent and to for imagined scenarios to be contradictory in nature. The upshot of all this is that Kant thinks that the moral laws can be discovered by reasoning about possible scenarios and discovering what's contradictory or not in those scenarios, thereby arriving at necessary and universal moral principles which are true for all people across all times. So a very different kind of approach than the one that Aristotle was interested in. And Kant, as we were talking about just a second ago, Kant was very unhappy with Aristotle's view because ultimately Aristotle's moral theory boils down to the claim that you should do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons in the right way. And Kant is here seen as suggesting that this is very unsatisfying because we don't know what the right time is, what the right way is. We don't know any of that, but that's exactly what we need to know. Now, Aristotle says practice and get in there and get your hands dirty and figure it out. But Kant wants ethics to be a science like logic or mathematics that we can work out just by reasoning without appeal to individual experiences. Now, this again sounds all very complicated, and in a sense it is complicated, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of what it's going to look like at the end. We're going to explain this in a lot more detail. So just to illustrate this, suppose that you have a duty to be honest. Kant does indeed think that truth-telling is one of our duties, and the book talks a little bit about why he thinks that. We'll come back to that. So now, suppose that there are these two people, right? And this is one of Kant's favorite examples. He says, suppose that there are these two different persons, each of them who owns some local bodega. So one of the bodega's owners is an honest businessman. He's honest, though, because he realizes that being honest is good for his business. So he sort of reasons as follows. Well, you see, if I overcharge people or charge one person one price and another person another price, then people will find out about this and they will, in effect, not come back because they know I'll rip them off. So the best way to keep my business going is for me to be honest. Now, this should, by the way, this description of this person should ring some bells for you. You should be thinking in your mind, aha, this person is an, yeah, if you heard the word egoist in your mind, then yes, or if you said it, then you were right. Kant's here describing the egoist view, right? So he's sort of targeting egoism here. So that's the way the egoist would describe why a person should be honest. Now, suppose that this other person, it also owns a bodega in a different neighborhood, let's say, and this person is also an honest businessman, charging fair prices, charging consistent prices, and so on. But suppose that this person is honest not because they think it's going to help their business, although that's a welcome byproduct of this, but suppose that they're honest because they sort of recognize that they have a duty to be honest. So what if this person thinks to themselves, you know, I own this shop, and being honest is an important moral duty, and so in my dealings with my customers, I've got to be honest and fair and make sure that they get quality products and that they're charged a fair price and that this is consistent over time. Now, according to Kant, only the second person's action has any moral value. The other person is acting selfishly, Kant thinks, and their action has no moral value at all. They do not count as performing a good action. See, this follows from Kant's our definition of what a good action is. A good action is one that's motivated in the right way, namely by a recognition of one's duties, and in particular one's moral duties. So the first person, although their action from the outside appears to be moral, isn't. They're faking it. They're not acting for the right reasons, Kant thinks, and therefore don't count as doing anything morally good. Now again, why does he think this? Well, think about a completely rational, disinterested spectator. So imagine that you were a godlike character who's not interested in either of these persons or their lives. You know, you're sort of watching this on a TV show or, you know, from some omniscient point of view, like in a movie. So you see one person being honest, but only because it benefits them, and you see that if they could get away with it, if it benefited them in some other way that without being honest, that they would. But it just so happens that this is the conclusion they've come to. There's no other way to get the things that they want. And then you see the other person who's being honest because they recognize that they should be honest. And that's what duties are encoded in these things, that we should do, that we ought to do. So this person is reasoning that they ought to keep their obligations, so they are. Now this disinterested spectator, which one is going to be the person whom is judged by this spectator to be doing the moral thing? Well, Kant feels very strongly that this rational, disinterested spectator is going to be pleased with the person who's acting because of their duties, and he's going to be sort of turning his nose up at this other person. It's sort of obvious, Kant thinks, that, well, you can see this guy's faking it and this guy's doing something morally good. Now, not everyone agrees with Kant, but that's the argument that he gives, that this rational, disinterested spectator would be interested, who could tell the difference, would judge one of these to be moral and the other one to be immoral. This is the only thing, according to Kant, which determines whether or not an action is a good action, or whether it was motivated by, This is the only thing that determines whether an action is a good action, and that's whether it's motivated by a recognition of a moral duty. So to oversimplify a bit, Kant thinks that there are really only two kinds of motivations. There are the ones that are explicit recognition of one's duties, and then there are the selfish ones. Now this includes, for instance, according to Kant, those people who are motivated to help others because it makes them feel good. And remember, this is something we've talked about. So Kant is here sort of responding to the various views that have come before him. Remember, he's writing in the 1790s, so there's been 2,000 years of discussion about ethics, and all the stuff that we've been talking about has been happening in that period. So there's been Aristotle's view. Hobbes was in the 1600s, so 150 years before Kant. People are talking about egoism, social contract theory, and that's basically part of the story that Kant's telling here. So the basic point that he wants to make against people who think that helping people and it producing a feeling in you is okay, and that was Rachel's argument. That's what I sort of lost my train of thought earlier, but that was the point I was trying to make, is all the people we've been discussing so far have been in the past, before Kant, except James Rachel's, who is a more contemporary figure. But even so, we can see Kant as, in effect, responding to the kinds of considerations that Rachel brings up. So remember, the egoist says, look, you're selfish because you want to help someone, and it produces this feeling in you, this feeling of pleasure. And so all you're trying to do is pursue that feeling of pleasure. It makes you feel good. And so therefore that action is selfish. Now Rachel's responds to this argument, yeah, but it's not really selfish. It doesn't really make sense to call it selfish, because what makes me feel good is helping other people. And it seems weird to call someone selfish who's helping other people. So you might think that Rachel's argument responds to Kant. But Kant's making a slightly different point here, and that's the arbitrariness of these inclinations or feelings. So, for instance, it might make you feel good to help other people. But that's accidental. What if it hadn't turned out that way? What if you didn't feel good helping other people? Then you wouldn't have any reason to do it? Kant says no, actually you would still have reason to do it. And if that's true, then the fact that you feel good as a result or as a result is accidental. And in fact, Kant often talks this way, that real moral actions are the ones that, well, I don't want to put this too strongly, but he often talks as though we can see what he's talking about in cases where we have duties that conflict very strongly with what our inclinations tell us to do. So he says, look, imagine someone who just doesn't care about other people because of their dispositional character. They just, they're not moved by the plight of the homeless person as they walk by them on the street. They see the person perhaps, shivering there with a sign that says, homeless vet, please help. And this person just isn't moved by that. But this person may recognize they have a duty to help others if they can, and they might say, okay, well, I have a duty to help you. Let me buy you a sandwich or something. I have a couple of extra dollars. I can afford that. So here's a person who doesn't want to help this person. It doesn't give them any satisfaction. It doesn't give them any joy. In fact, it might cause them some kind of pain. Helping them, they might think, God, why do I have to do this? Well, why? Is because they recognize that they have a duty to do it. Now, Kant doesn't think that that's required in order to make helping people or performing any of one's duties moral. But it certainly illustrates this distinction that he's trying to make here, which is that it's one thing to fill the pool of a duty. It's another thing to get pleasure from doing that. So it may be the case that most people, hopefully all, but clearly not, but maybe most, people feel good about themselves after helping other people, after telling the truth, after doing the various things that they ought to do. That's a wonderful thing, and Kant doesn't deny that you can't feel good about yourself after you perform your duties. That's fine. But he thinks that that's sort of an arbitrary, accidental fact about us, and if it were different, if you didn't feel good, in fact, even if it produced in you a sense of dissatisfaction, you would still have these obligations. And you can still see in key instances the pull of an obligation one way and an inclination in the other way. And we can really see, Kant thinks, something that's going to be essential for him. The exercise of free, rational control over our actions in the cases where we choose to perform our duty even though we're not inclined to or don't want to. Even if it doesn't make us feel good, we may nonetheless feel this pull to the duty. And that pull inspires, that the force of that pull from the inside, from the recognition that one has this duty, is what prompts Kant to say it fills him with ever-increasing awe. In fact, as much awe as staring up into the heavens above. He's just awestruck by the power that moral commands seem to have over people. If someone really recognizes that they have a duty, it can pull them. It can override everything else. It has this amazing power. And that's what Kant's talking about when he's talking about being motivated by the recognition of one's duties.